Doctors, nurses, EMTs, etc. What's the most shocking thing you've seen after thinking, nothing could surprise me anymore? I think I've mentioned this one in the past. Elderly guy came in the middle of winter, legs were frozen to mid-thigh, and I mean truly, ice block frozen. At the same time, he had a bunch of serious burns all over his torso. His gas had been cut off in the middle of winter, technically illegal if the gas company has documentation of an elderly or handicapped person in the home. He had been trying to keep warm with an incandescent light bulb. He kept falling asleep and the bulb would fall on him, waking him up and causing small, fairly deep burns. He had immediate lower extremity amputations, rewarming, and went to the burn unit. He ended up dying within a few days. The level of suffering he must have gone through is immense. To this day, it's one of the saddest, most preventable deaths I've ever seen. Next story. A patient's insurance company refused to pay for a PET scan. When the patient said they would pay for their own PET scan out of pocket, the insurance company said they would refuse to pay for any treatment, testing, or further workup based on evidence from the PET scan, if she paid for it herself. It was the most petty, bullcrap, evil thing I've seen insurance do in a long time, and I see them do petty bullcrap every day. Next story. This guy kept coming to my unit because he was aspirating on something. He had a tracheostomy and a feeding tube in his stomach, so we were confused why he was being admitted every few weeks for aspiration if he wasn't consuming food orally. We eventually learned that his sister/wife, yes, had been pouring whiskey down his trach. To top it off, he groped or tried to grope every female nurse and tech that had him. Next story. 20-year medic. It's actually really hard to say what's the most shocking, but I once had a guy on hallucinogens completely remove all the tissue from his left forearm. Took it clear down to the radius and ulna. Dude was just chilling like everything was normal. It was crazy and it definitely goes on the list. Yeah, hallucinogens, drugs are very, very powerful in this regard. Like you lose all sense of feeling and spatial awareness, where you are, what you're doing. That is just wild for him to do that and not even feel it. Next story. Registered vet tech with 21 years experience. A 17-week-old kitten declawed at home because he scratched the owner while playing. The little dude also had all 4 of his canine teeth broken, and his feet were burned with a lighter to cauterize the bleeding. I have 16 years of experience in ER. I've seen some crap, but this is the one that made me cry while on shift. Anyway, previous owner was charged with felony animal cruelty, and the kitten lives with me now. He goes to work with me every day. Next story. Case I saw as an ER resident. Warning, this is graphic. Severe burn victim, probably 70% full thickness burns. Brought in barely alive, was trapped in a car that caught fire after a crash. His body was completely charred black from the mid-chest down, and parts of him crumbled off when EMS moved him to the stretcher. I have no idea how he lived long enough to make it to the hospital. It was the most horrifying thing I've ever seen. I think about him multiple times a month, and this happened 7 years ago. The trauma and ER attendings agreed that this was not a survivable situation. We were able to get an IV in his neck and put him on a fentanyl drip for comfort, and he passed very quickly. Thinking about the case makes me sick years later. I can't imagine what he had to endure. Never seen anything like it since. Next story. Worked in an ICU. Woman had a very premature baby at home, like 25 to 26 weeks gestation. She and her partner decided to put the baby in a tube sock and then in a shoebox and bring it to the hospital. But they got hungry and went through a McDonald's drive-thru with said very tiny baby in a sock box. It wasn't so much that they did the drive-thru, but that they told everyone about it and didn't think it was an interesting choice. Kid turned out reasonably okay. Next story. I cut into a guy and the bones in his body were green, like a moss green. Turns out he'd taken a lot of tetracycline as a kid and that's what did it. Absolutely wild. Also, undressed a deceased woman to do a physical exam. Removed her Johnny shirt and it looked like there was a head of cauliflower growing out of her vulva. Worst case of genital warts I've ever seen. Next story. Just before I retired, I was working as an EMS lieutenant, first rank of being a supervisor. I worked in a huge city that had a lot of different radio frequencies for different sections of the city. I was supposed to sit on the border of central and north and monitored both frequencies so I could respond to jobs without having to have the dispatchers relay the message. One night, the North got a call for a shooting. As I put it in gear, I hear another unit on Central get called to the same address for a cardiac arrest. My jimmies fully rustled, I floor it and tell both that I'm responding. Upon arrival, along with police and a fire engine, we are met by the patient's girlfriend, who's sobbing but motions us into the apartment that has been given an Event Horizon-themed makeover. There's just a comical amount of blood. We follow the blood into the bathroom and find a guy sitting on the toilet holding a towel against his head. He takes it away for a second and there's obvious arterial spray from his temple. He says he's fine and for us to leave. The girlfriend says it's a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Neither are directly true. The cops start demanding to know where the gun is, but there is no gun. Dude used a effing crossbow, the size of a large pistol. He made it to the hospital fine and likely made a full recovery, but as we were patching him up, one of the medics, one of the funniest people I've ever met, paused and said, quote, "Between the 5 firemen, 4 cops, 2 EMTs, 2 paramedics, and the EMS supervisor, there's gotta be over 100 years of experience in this room. Any of you ever had a crossbow injury before?" This was followed by a chorus of, from everyone realizing how effing bizarre this whole situation was. Well, I'm no expert on the matter, but I can definitely say that is definitely the first crossbow-related injury in this regard that I have ever heard of. So, yeah, you might be alone here, OP. Next story. First code/death I saw was an elderly woman vomiting poop. She had had a stroke several years back and her doctors thought she was silently aspirating and was diagnosed with a pneumonia, but also constipation so bad it caused a bowel obstruction. Stool had backed up so far that it was causing reflux, which she also had been silently aspirating, and after a slow deterioration, she puked up all this old poop, coded, and died. When we did post-mortem care and rolled her to clean her and change her sheets, more poop vomit that had been in the back of her throat kept dribbling out of her mouth. Next story. I've answered this before, so here it is again. Spoiler alert for triggered and squeamish. Don't read further, skip to the end. Day off on vacation with another paramedic. On the highway, saw an incident happening in the distance. We were in the funnel to get by. No PD, fire, or EMS on scene, and it was bad, so we stopped to help. This was early days of cell phones, but we had one and called it in. I should have known by the smell what was going on when I opened my car door. Diesel, body parts, exhaust. I will never forget that smell. Internal organs have their own special smell, and if lavender was in that mix, lavender would repulse me for the rest of my life. DPS report said a pickup truck at 80 mph blew a tire and went into oncoming lanes and hit an 18-wheeler at the pinch point, driving the 18-wheeler into the lanes of traffic the first truck originated from. This caused a head-on collision with a family car at about 120 mph combined impact, and the impacts from the vehicles that couldn't stop drove the family car under the cab of the 18-wheeler. The vehicles were so badly mangled you couldn't tell it was a pickup. Triage is a system where you look at the injuries and decide who's going to get help. You look at dead or dying and realize you can't help them and move on to someone else who is dying but you can save, and you help them. Had to do that. 5 fatalities. Pickup truck driver was in pieces, literally. 18-wheeler driver had to be life-flighted to trauma. 3 others transported to ER with serious but not life-threatening injuries. Hour and a half later, we're still trying to get the cab off the family car with a high crane type wrecker, even though I had already given up hope of anybody being alive. Relatives of the family car had passed the accident but didn't see the car, as it was crushed under the cab of the 18-wheeler and was unrecognizable. Returned to the scene when their loved ones were behind, weren't at home. DPS fire, EMS, and wreckers had been on the scene for a while. My friend and I had taken a back seat to rescue efforts by this time, and had cleaned up and were leaving as we would only be in the way at this point, when the family approached us to ask about the details. The rescue effort moved into high gear when I told the captain that the possible occupants of the family car was a mother, father, grandmother, and 1-day-old infant that had just been released from the hospital a few hours before. They were the other 4 fatalities. Ton of bricks, just as vivid as the day it happened. Next story. A plant growing out of this homeless guy's abscessed jaw. Some dude having a priapism, sustained erection, after having injected cocaine directly into his chicken. Treated by pulling blood out from his chicken by hand, Q 20 minutes by 10 hours. A guy who carted his testicular mass into clinic with a cart. He was a farmer. Another guy who we'd asked to bring in a urine sample the next time we saw him in 2 weeks. who saved every drop of pee to bring to us. His wife was getting mad because he was using all her mason jars. Oh, so many good ones. Wild times, and I'm not even a urologist. Next story. Mental health crisis worker. I worked for a lockdown psych unit with a heavy SVP, sexually violent predator, and just an all-around scary population of men. On this particular day, it was all female staff with the exception of one small man, and we are all tiny people. Management sucked and poorly/inadequately staffed all the time. We had an SVP, M over 32, 6'3", 375 pounds. This man was a mountain who liked to hit his head on the wall until he had large open wounds on his face and forehead. He loved seeing blood, playing in it, drinking it, collecting it, self-pleasuring with it. It didn't matter where the blood came from or how he got it. It was just endless fun for him. The day prior, he had hit his head in his cell and needed to get his head stapled shut, and from there, sent to our facility for mental health treatment. We had him on a 1-to-1, and he had his back turned away from staff and used a psych pen to help dig out the staples. It quickly became apparent what he was doing, and my coworker hit the alarm, and the rest of us came running. Nursing saw and ran back to the station to get our lights out shot. Once he realized he could put his finger in, he just started shoving his fingers deeper in the wound and trying to pull down in the wound, and then hit his head on the wall. Blood is splattered everywhere. Like, there was so much blood. It was like watching a real-life horror movie. Anyway, he turns to us with a soulless stare, flat effect, and drenched in blood. He says, quote, "Your turn." He turns and looks at me and launches toward me, and I take off running. He's laughing like a goddamn hyena, saying, "Gotcha, it's just a prank," and then proceeds to sit down and played in the blood like he was in a splash pool. He was given a night-night shot and a trip to the ED. Next story. We once had this really old frail woman in our care who got a skin infection on her foot that just started getting worse and worse. It was becoming necrotic, so there were two options. Either they amputate it but run the risk of killing her in surgery because she's that frail and old, or we do nothing but just keep cleaning it, elevating it and bandaging it up in the hope that maybe it'll get better. LOL. It was a moral dilemma that only the family could choose. Death and comfort now, or later at the expense of constant pain. Her family were so effing stupid and oblivious to her needs. They treated her as if she were still in her prime, despite the fact she couldn't swallow whole foods anymore. They'd give her solid foods and act shocked when she began choking, and then would need to be rescued. Of course, they decided to not go through with the surgery for their mum just to squeeze out another month or two of life from her. The most in denial, deluded family I've ever witnessed. Yes, it's sad when our parents die, but I would never prolong their suffering just because I'd feel sad when they eventually go. I was there once when the nurses cleaned out the wound, and y'all, it was black. Black with literal bone visible, and no amount of painkillers could truly make her not feel like the cleaning process. We repeated this process every few days. I held her hand as this nonverbal woman would just scream as it was cleaned. Everyone in my area cheered when she died. It's bittersweet being so happy and relieved for her death, because it meant she was finally at peace. Next story. I was a nursing student a few years back. During clinicals, I saw a lot. In 1 week, I saw one of my patients lose a bit more of his foot from progressing gangrene that we just could not get ahead of for some goddamn reason. A colostomy bag seal failure that started draining into an open wound bed. I'll never forget the smell. A guy with jaundice that was so bad that I thought he had stepped straight out of The Simpsons, and was bitten by no less than 2 separate dementia patients, one of which had C. diff. I didn't stay in the program very long, but I will never forget my time working in the hospital. For those of you wondering what happened, I was doing nursing through the Army, thus making a 4-year course be squeezed down into 1 year, and my instructors were, unfortunately, poorly equipped to meet the demands of the new NCLEX. That's the problem with being in the pilot program. The instructors are also trying to figure it out. The Army didn't provide room for perceived failures in testing. Next story. A guy whose blood pressure was so high it caused a nosebleed so severe he was bleeding out of his eyes. Also, the amount of blood that came from the gastric esophageal varices when they burst. A few months ago, I suctioned close to a liter of blood from a guy's nose and mouth in the 10 minutes we attempted to band his varices. It did not work. ICU put in a Linton tube, took it out a few days later, he exsanguinated again and died. Really horrible. Next story. Took care of a guy with frostbite to all 10 toes. He had gotten high on meth and walked 15 miles barefoot in the snow in a northwestern state. I came in to paint with betadine his mummified toes, and he didn't know he was going to lose them all. Some doctor didn't tell him. I stepped out to clarify, and they told me to tell him. I'm an RN, and they told me to let him know he was going to lose all 10 toes. I felt bad, but did my job. He acted like it was nothing and just kept on making out with his girlfriend. I think he was still on meth because they were climbing all over each other while I was trying to do wound care. I finally told her she couldn't sit in his lap anymore while I worked. I couldn't believe they were acting that way anyways. I was just shocked that he was losing all 10 toes. They would self-mummify, break off, and he would be toeless and be fine with it. It was just weird. He was also in his early 30s. Next story. Exercise physiologist in a rehab clinic for heart and lung patients, many recovering from open heart surgery or aortic valve replacements. I've seen people not heed mine or the doctor's strict warnings to not do anything that could reopen the healing chest scar from then being quite literally opened up. But I had a patient whose inclusion site was raised in a bubbly-looking way when I was giving them a physical assessment. I mentioned that I don't like the look of it and told them to see the cardiologist ASAP, as well as I messaged their cardiologist and PCP personally to explain the situation. Both docs gave them the okay to come back and exercise. Well, it popped while on a rec bike from, I'm guessing, pressure buildup of fluid, because not only was there blood, but milky pus/fluid leaking out with the blood. Another one a few weeks after that was a patient who I later found out was septic, having a 170 heart rate, and was so delirious he fought me verbally and physically, and got a good punch to the center of my chest and face. When I called for an ambulance and refused to have him drive home, he drove to the clinic. I'm so happy he didn't cause an accident, and I walked around with a nice black eye for a bit. Luckily, I made a fun spin on it by telling patients a resistance band did it to me because I didn't follow proper safety precautions with them. Next story. 911 EMT. Fire department hastily requested EMS after a lift assist. Dude had wicked advanced skin cancer and half his face, neck, and chest was down to dry bone as it got further out. It was various stages of decaying. His nose was gone, and you could see into his nasal pharynx and down into his oral pharynx via what was left of the roof of his mouth. Dude signed a refusal, wanted nothing to do with the ER or us. The fire captain was pissed we didn't just take him because, quote, he's effed up. Yeah, no crap, Sherlock, but he can refuse medical care if he wants. Next story. Last winter during a really cold spell coupled with snow, I had a resident in the locked memory care I worked decide that the building was on fire. 2 a.m. he took a suitcase from his closet and threw it through the window in his room. He had a roommate who slept in a bed directly under the window. Suitcase guy crawled over his sleeping roommate and out the window to the firehouse down the road to get help. They called the police because they thought a homeless man was hallucinating. NOC shift didn't notice any of this until roommate came out much later and said he needed another blanket because he was so cold and it was snowing on him. They checked and sure enough, his bed was covered in glass and old helpful Harry was gone. It was a crap show. Next story. ERRN here. The baby born en route coming from 4 hours north. Preemie at 29 weeks. No esophagus, no soft palate, no genitals, severely deformed spine and extremities, only one leg, not breathing on their own, and literally none of the organs developed anywhere close to functionally. Mom had a long history of substance abuse, including throughout the pregnancy. The prenatal care, despite her community trying extremely hard. Other children already apprehended. Oh, and mom was hemorrhaging. Big time. Not necessarily the most shocking, but it definitely sticks with me. One of the paramedics that brought them was absolutely distraught. Edit to add. Mom ended up recovering with no complications. Baby was kept alive for 7 hours before mom finally withdrew care and passed peacefully in her arms. Next story. I'm an EMT. I believe I've posted this story here before, but here goes. older female being horribly neglected by her husband/caretaker. This older lady in her 70s fell down early summer, and we had a crew go out there to check on her. She was alert and able to make her own choices. She refused EMS care and decided to stay on the floor. A few months go by, we get called out there again. We walk into the small home and instantly smell human crap and rotting flesh. She's still on the floor on the same side with a blanket covering her. We lift the blanket and she only has a shirt on, is covered in crap and piss with open, clearly infected wounds with bugs in them. She's able to grunt to pain and nothing else. There's weeks worth of crap in this tiny room she's in. Her husband is behind us yelling, "I can't do this anymore," and other crap. We call for help and PD and attempt to move this woman. We struggle to move her as she's been laying in the same spot for so long that she's been fused into the carpet floor by all her bodily fluids. We rip her off the floor like a band-aid, which makes more wounds, and carry her outside. Her poopy legs rubbed against my pants, and my partner got some form of fluids on him that ate through his pants. It literally looked like someone threw acid on this dude's crotch. PD has us on body cam throwing up. We transport her and she dies 3 days later to sepsis. PD decides not to pursue charges on her husband because he was too old. I was 19 and had 4 months on the job when I had this call. My first year was trial by fire. Yeah, if you can make it through that, I don't see anything else topping that. You make it through that, you can make it through anything. Goodness. Next story. I used to volunteer for an organization that provided respite care for medically complex children. The most difficult thing I experienced was working with a girl who had a self-injurious stimming behavior. Stimming is a repetitive behavior that people with diagnoses such as autism use to self-soothe. Unfortunately, sometimes it can be harmful, such as headbanging or scratching. Her stim was to forcefully reach behind her eyes and her eye sockets to attempt to pull them out. The solution was essentially keeping her hands busy with stimulating toys, but when it occasionally happened before I was able to redirect, I would gag in my mouth. I hope she's doing better behaviorally now. No instance of CPR or wound care has come close to that for me. Next story. First of all, you learn really fast to never say never working in healthcare. No matter how many years you do it, you'll always see something for the first time, at the very least, once every few months or so. That being said, there are still other things that shock me and or creep me out no matter how many times I see them, including teratomas will always creep me out. I think a lot of people already know what they are, but for those that don't, they are tumors that contain several types of tissue, including hair, teeth, and fingernails. Just no. The total lack of care for another's life. How people treat elderly family members is definitely on the list. The worst is always a parent's abuse of infants or children. I'll never forget a read out of a skeletal survey of a 7-month-old that had just passed showing old and new fractures of pretty much every single bone in the body. Based on the aging of the fractures, that baby had to have been beaten several times pretty much every day of their life. Finally, I'll never forget a relatively young, think late teens or early 20s, man who had shoved the rubber gripper of a pen up his urethra, chicken, because he couldn't pee. Next story. ER doc. The most shocking things I've seen are things that would make you hate humanity and haunt my nightmares. But here's a few fun stories. When I was early in my EMS career, got a sick person call. Lady used to be 500 pounds and hadn't been able to get up from her couch in a few weeks. Dunno how she was still alive, but she was, barely. Fused to the couch fabric by her own excrement and skin oil/sweat. Smelled like 1,000 dead goats rotting in a dumpster forgotten in a Houstonian summer. As a med student, saw at least 2 people put on involuntary psych holds because no one cared to testify that English wasn't their first language. I found one because I went round on the psychotic man found wandering in the parking lot. Realized he wasn't speaking gibberish, just Korean. Fully oriented, and was wandering that parking lot looking for someone to help him with his flat tire. As an intern, first year of training to be an ER doc, finished coding a morbidly obese lady. Rolled her once we called it to do a back exam. Found one of her pet cats underneath her, also dead. Unknown TOD for the cat. Had a man who touched a very high voltage live wire. Had 100% burns down to his bones, and the force of the electricity essentially blew off all 5 of his limbs. Smelled like burnt barbecue. Had a lady show up altered, not moving her legs. and an EKG showing a heart attack. EMS told me she did a bunch of cocaine. Family later stated she occasionally smokes pot, but no hard drugs, and was by all accounts a pleasant woman. Anyway, she had an aortic dissection extending up her carotid artery and down to her renal arteries. At that point, there is a blood clot cutting off all flow to the kidneys and legs. Had a mentally normal 16-year-old swallow a bunch of magnets and give himself a bowel obstruction. Came in for right lower quadrant pain with normal ultrasound. MRI was down that day, so we got a CT scan to look for appendicitis, because he never thought to tell anyone. Lucky MRI was getting maintenance at that time. Young buck shot in the chest. Bullet missed his heart, but the shockwave and cocaine caused him to effectively also have a heart attack. Coronary dissection. Those are just some off the top of my head. Next story. Cousin works in ER. I recall a story along the lines of, "Nothing can surprise me anymore. What's that smell? Cheese. Vaginal cheese. A wheel full of it." Patient was presenting with a very severe yeast infection. They took off her pants and it just splat onto the floor with a smell that could make Chernobyl habitable by compensation. I don't know what's worse, the fact that she said it was not the worst thing she saw, or having to enter with a hazmat team to clean it up. Next story. I've talked to numerous medical providers. I've heard some really tragic, insane, and unbelievable things. This remains the most unfortunate and craziest. I was coming off a 24 shift in the ICU when I was an intern. A woman had met up with some friends for Bible study and decided to spend the night at her friend's place. At some point in the night, the friend checked up on the woman. Upon opening the door, she found the woman, 2 items, and a decent amount of blood. I'll pause the story for a moment for you to consider what those 2 items might be before continuing. The woman, 2 items, covered in blood. The woman was alive, and the 2 items next to her were her eyeballs. Both of them. Complete enucleation. She had forcibly removed both her eyeballs. No other objects were found. We think she did it with just her fingers. The paramedics brought her eyes with her in little saline bottles. You could see the optic nerve coming out of the back, and the little attachment points of the extraocular muscles that help turn the eye in different directions were visible as well. A clear liquid was seen running down her cheeks. I initially thought the liquid was tears, but it was cerebral spinal fluid leaking out the little holes in the back of the eye socket where the optic nerve centers the brain. Turns out she was schizophrenic, and we believe read a Bible passage that mentioned something about, if your eyes cause you to sin, you should gouge them out, or something similar. She survived, but is blind for the rest of her life. Tragic story. Next story. Skeletonized calf and foot while still attached to the rest of the limb. Patient was abused and neglected by their caretaker. I've seen plenty of CLTI cases, but that patient literally only had bone and a little bit of tendon left on them. It was like it had already been picked clean by vultures and bugs. The patient ended up having a full amputation of the leg due to infection that had migrated higher up. Another one that I'll always remember is a rodeo clown that came into the ED after being pushed down and trampled by a bull. His testicles were smashed, like completely pulverized. There was nothing left to save. I think they ended up getting plastic surgery and prosthetic testes. Next story. Not a nurse, but my brother dated one. She assisted in a case where a homeless guy had been wearing jeans, and when they wore out, he just put a new pair over the top of them, and then again later, so he had 3 pairs of jeans on. Never took them off, never bathed unless he jumped in a lake or whatever, and his leg hairs had grown through all 3 sets, so they had to surgically remove them. What would compel one to do this? I just don't quite understand how this would work and how no one in this guy's life stepped in and prevented this from happening. That is ridiculous. Next story. I've seen people break a window and shave the front of their thighs off to the bone. Peeled drunk people off the sidewalk that were frozen to it because they peed themselves. I pushed 3-year-olds off their mothers who were dying from a fentanyl overdose. I've pulled people out of sex swings to perform CPR. Babies thrown in dumpsters in the middle of winter. I had a regular that rented his colostomy hole for people to F. People who don't have community found weeks after they're dead and their decomposing body is starting to meld into its surface. Self-unalivings, knife fights, gunshots, machete is popular here. I've gone into drug dens and gang holdouts. What surprises me is not how absurd something is anymore, it's who lives and who dies. People who took unimaginable damage walk away, and something as minor as a stubbed toe turns into septic shock and dies. I don't save anyone. Death picks its time, not us. Next story. I work in acute rehabilitation, so not as crazy as an ER, but I have a few. First was an elderly woman clearly not taken care of at home. Her toenails were so long that they curled completely under like those goats with the curly horns. The worst part was that she had prolapsed uterus and her uterus had pressure injuries, bed sores on it. No idea why none of this was addressed during her acute hospitalization. Impossible that no one noticed, and they should have reported the family for negligence but didn't, so we had to. Patient on for cardiac rehab after a CABG dropped in the bathroom and we did CPR. His incision opened during compressions and blood was everywhere. We sent him 911 back to the hospital. He had his surgery in and he returned to us after surgery and did great and was discharged home. These two are more emotional than gory, but the first is a patient who had a TBI who was very mobile after but cognitively impaired. He was also very aggressive and mean, which was not his baseline at all. His wife was a nurse and was great during all our teaching sessions. Day of DC, so we called and no response. We sent police for a wellness check and found her in the tub after taking a bottle of pills and an entire bottle of wine. She survived and admitted she felt like a failure being a nurse, but unable to emotionally deal with the significant cognitive and emotional changes her husband had. He went to a nursing home while she was in the hospital, and I'm not sure if he ever went back home. The second is a patient with Parkinson's who was end stage. His family had been withholding info from the outpatient neurologist about his decline, telling her it wasn't as bad as it was. I think it was part embarrassment, he had become aggressive and hallucinating a lot, and part they wanted him at home and not a SNF, even though he was more than they could handle. His wife had just been released from the hospital and came in with their daughter for a visit. He became aggressive and swung at his daughter, and his wife moved back to avoid getting hit and fell and broke her wrist. She died a few days later from a multitude of pre-existing conditions and complications. We discharged him, and he died a week later in a nursing home. Next story. Working COVID ICU and people coming in still thinking COVID was make-believe, refusing to be tested for COVID because it was a liberal lie. We would then place them in COVID ICU since we couldn't be sure that they were COVID negative. They would be surrounded by people who, quite honestly, were most likely going to die intubated from COVID. A lot of them, shortly after arriving, would quietly suddenly agree to being tested. It was infuriating and discouraging to see so many people so deep into Fox News that they wouldn't listen to anything else until they were already in the unit. I used to think zombie movies weren't realistic because people couldn't be that dumb, but now I think they aren't realistic because half the population would be screaming, "How dare you try to keep the zombies from biting me?" Next story. Social worker. Dude cracked an egg into a needle and tried to inject it to boost his testosterone levels. Massive infection that led to a few weeks in hospital. Came out just fine and enjoyed all the attention from healthcare workers. Little more detail. I worked in the developmental sector for a while, in part doing direct work providing supportive housing to people. This is a trans man that received testosterone injections in-house by a nurse every other week, and the needles and testosterone were kept in his unit. Not once did he utilize his testosterone without the nurse's presence, but doing his own research, he'd read online that eggs could boost testosterone levels, and made the leap that injecting it would be the most effective way. He came to the unit I was working in very scared, crying with a very red and inflamed arm saying, "I think I made a mistake." 911 promptly called, and medical supplies in his unit transferred to a locked cabinet for the remainder of his years with us. Next story. I'm an RN. I watched a mother hold her dying 9-month-old due to her leaving this baby in the care of a drug dealer she just met. He beat the crap out of her for whatever reason. She held her as she was dying, saying that she knew she was a good mom and this wasn't her fault. Mom has a very long history with CPS. I've never wanted to punch someone in the face so much. Next story. Not medical staff or anything, but I was a prison boss for way too long, and my last job with the state was at the prison wing of a public hospital. Stoma with gonorrhea ×2. Same guy. Stoma guy came in several times, also because he kept hiding foreign objects and said stoma. Swallowed razor blades were, at bare minimum, a weekly thing. Object lost in anus. Wasn't major contraband, so sent back to unit. Came back a few hours later with a pencil up his ass he used to try and get the original whatever out. Lots of mental health injuries. several instances of drugs, razors, and a shank hidden under the skin, as in, offender opened himself, made a pocket, and hid the object. K2 is bad. Do not F with that crap. It can leave you effed for the rest of your life. Cut off own chicken. Cut off and ate own chicken. Remove testicles. Foot necrosis. Diabetics, please take care of yourselves. Self-dentistry. Pulled own teeth. Split his own tongue. And that's what I can think offhand. There's more, but I gotta go shopping. Next story. Ex-EMT. We got toned out one night to a parking lot by PD for a fight. When we got there, you could tell it was a good one by the way the officers looked at us. Two sisters had gotten in a fight over a boy, and one of them bit the other's middle finger clean off. We spent a good 5 to 10 minutes looking for the finger in the parking lot, and my partner finally found it. Except it wasn't like a clean bite on the missing finger side. It looked like the girl who did the biting had gnawed on it pretty good before spitting it out. I never could wrap my head around the chewing on the finger part. Next story. Kind of related. I worked in a pathology lab. If you don't know, a path lab is where all the gross stuff that either comes out of or comes off a patient, like tumors, moles, legs, arms, bodies, babies, dead, eyes, ears, breast implants, those weird twins that grow inside people, biopsies, etc., etc. It's a world of wonder. So one day, the leg came down from a severe diabetic who had chose to let his necrotic leg fester. The experienced PA who was dissecting the leg, as normal, all of a sudden stepped back in terror and exclaimed, "Holy F!" And then he dry heaved. Now, this PA did autopsies on the reg, and he was grossed out. Anyways, yada yada yada, when the pathologist cut into the leg, bugs came pouring out. A leg that was attached to a living, breathing human just hours ago. A mobile home for bugs that were just munching away at his leg while he was probably sitting at some Denny's days before. Next story. My dad discovered that his septum was deviated in just the wrong way. He found out when he started bleeding to death through his nose. In and out of the ER several times trying to stop the bleeding, till they cauterized his nose and put a balloon up there for a few days. Turns out the angle his nose was deviated created a perfect wind tunnel for the artery up there. And that's how everyone in the family got nose jobs, to prevent anyone else almost dying from nosebleeds. Next story. The saddest was a dementia patient I had. The last 8 weeks she was alive, she would just cry and say the same phrase over and over. Turns out that the phrase was one of the worst days of her life. The woman was reliving her worst day ever on repeat, every 10 to 15 minutes, over and over and over, just bawling. And not that normal sort of crying, but that hits you in the gut. Their pain is so evident with their cry type of cry. I've never wanted euthanasia to be a thing more than I did for that woman. Next story. Nurse here. Once in the ER in rural Australia, I spent a whole shift looking after a man who'd been attacked with a machete. Story went, there was a Nigerian fellow on the run from the police who jumped the fence into his backyard. The man had just shot up some meth and thought that the guy in his backyard represented a threat to his 3-year-old daughter. So he grabbed a machete and went out and whacked this other guy in the head with it. The Nigerian guy reaches up, pulls the machete out of his head, and starts going to town on the meth man. Meth man ends up with hundreds of deep lacerations all over his body. Head, arms, torso. You could see fat, muscle, bone. Cut tendons. It couldn't move some of his body anymore, yet somehow he made it to the hospital conscious and okay. The only arterial bleed he had was if he flexed his left wrist. Suddenly, there'd be a spurt of blood. It was interesting having to apply pressure to all of it. Tourniquets for the limbs, but that traps the blood in the limb, which then causes venous bleeding in the lacerations, which need direct pressure. It's a bit of a balancing act. It was just a coppery sink of blood all through the emergency room. The guy ended up waiting for an air ambulance about 6 hours, then got lifted out. Nigeria guy ended up with a depressed skull fracture, but was really okay in the end. So wild to think that we just had a full-blown machete fight here, where both sides were severely cut and injured, but overall, obviously no fatalities, but the fact that they're both mostly okay in the long run, what in the world? Must have been a dull machete. Next story. Medic here, like a lot of others on here, it's hard to really narrow it down. At a point, shocking becomes the norm, and the boring becomes the agonizing. However, one particularly bad black cloud of a month where I was having a code on every shift and my partners thought I was cursed. We got a call for an OD in the Wawa parking lot. We got there first before PD or the engine, and me and this equally smallish woman dragged this dude from his car where he was crumpled up and not breathing. so no goods. Did the old Narcan bagging, and he was risen once again. He just looked at us for a moment before letting out the most hellish scream ever, and then, from inside the car, another scream happened as a clump of blankets in the passenger seat became alive as well, where his buddy had been out. He started fighting us, and his buddy crawled over to grab my partner, and luckily, a jump truck showed up with my two burly fire bros, and they started to pull the passenger off my partner's ass as we fought with the first one. My partner managed to pin the driver down, and I ran to our truck to get Verst unlocked. And I just remember my hand shaking and covered in blood as I tried to undo both the locks and draw it up. I got back out and tried to bring the calmness, but he proceeded to beat the crap out of the two of us. And the fire guys were also struggling with their guy, one of them getting dragged through the mulch by the time I hit my emergency, back up everyone else, blah 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 button. We got all the cops, another medic unit, an engine, and it was still like fighting two gods. The Verst was not working, and it took 8 per person to tie them down on the stretcher, and even that was not working well. We decided on diesel instead and ended up at 2 different hospitals, where it took everyone to get our guy in. He ended up with a vec drip and intubated in the ICU, as did his buddy. What's messed up is that's like the 3rd case in many years of that happening. Just psychosis or some drug that we don't know what is. One of the ICU docs told me they think ketamine and cocaine at one point, but I don't know if the kids are still doing Calvin Klein these days. Anyways, when I pass that Wawa now, I get a little bit like the gif of the dog with the cupcakes. Next story. I can see anything. It's the smells that get me. We had a homeless guy who was a bad diabetic come in during the middle of winter. He was suffering from frostbite, but refused to take off his boots for several weeks. He required bilateral below-the-knee amputations. Holy hell, that smell. I've seen shaken babies, and I wept for the person they could have become die at the hands of an adult entrusted with their care. I've witnessed gift of life bully multiple families in organ donation while denying last requests for one final embrace before being wheeled back. I watched a teenage girl die on the table after getting shot in a case of mistaken identity. She and her mother went out to get fruit, and some gang members thought the car belonged to a rival. I'll never forget the scream from the mother after being told we lost her daughter. It was the sound of a heart being broken. Medical examiners are absolute pricks and take pleasure in making your job harder. They already know the answers to the questions they're asking. I lost a former NFL player who accidentally was shot when the gun in his bag went off in a dealership after he dropped his bag on the floor. His femoral artery had been severed. We went through every unit of his blood type in the hospital. He was bleeding it out just as quickly as we were putting it in. The only reason he held on as long as he did is because he was in prime shape and trying to get another tryout. The smell of copper from all the blood on the floor remained in the room for hours. I'll never forget watching a mother cover her post-ATV accident brain-dead 12-year-old son up in a blanket before being wheeled back for an organ procurement because she said he looked cold. I had finally had enough of this when a surgeon I've worked with for years called me a effing idiot for handing him the wrong instrument. Next story. My brother is a volunteer firefighter, and they got called to the local drug house for a possible overdose. A police officer had arrived before they did. The police carry Narcan and can administer it, and one of the other residents of the drug house freaked out and thought the cop was there to arrest her. Her solution? Climb onto the roof of the 2-story house and fly away. She did get to fly, though, in a medevac helicopter. Next story. Braid in a bottle. She told us it was drugs. She kept it in her bits. Second place goes to a sword. Handle first. Rectal. Third is a big plastic table leg off a children's playset. The whole leg. Meth is one heck of a drug. Craziest story I've heard was a medic from Texas treated a man who took his own arm off with a table saw and self-pleasured with it. His reason? He was mad at his dad. Next story. I'm an ICU nurse. The things I find most horrible now aren't probably what most people look for. It's human behavior. Anyone that does what we do will know. I don't see some of the things paramedics see, like young families dead on roadways, but I see people torture their elders way past expiration dates. But here are some of the more grisly, shocking things I've seen. Young firemen impaled from one eye through the opposite side of the skull, occipital. I got him from the OR and was touch and go all night for weeks after. Still alive, doing okay. Blind, I think, in one side. Point blank shotgun blast to the thigh. 2 tourniquets, flesh only held on by maybe a couple inches of skin and a bit of muscle. I think she kept the leg, but I don't know how functional it is. Car crash with massive head trauma. Brain matter herniating out of both ears. Died, obviously. Beaten to death with nunchucks. Jane Doe called girl, strangled, probably dead a while before found and revived. Died. Stayed in a burning house, slowly sucked out charred lung from his ET tube for a few days, and he slowly got worse respiratory-wise. Face destroyed by a buffalo. I think I have a lot, but I'd have to think. These are just off the top of my head. The most dangerous thing we all do is drive. If you drive an open-air vehicle like an ATV or motorcycle, I would urge you to have good life insurance and a solid will and power of attorney situated. Next story. A patient with untreated melanoma that had literally eaten away her face. She had a cavity where her nose used to be. Her long hair was completely matted to the top of her head like a helmet and was only hanging on by a handful of hairs. She had to go to surgery for a procedure and asked me to shave her head before she went. While I was shaving her head, she said, "I don't want to die today." I sent her off to surgery and then went and cried in the bathroom. She did survive the procedure, but passed soon after. Next story. Warning, burn victim. I was a medic on an EMT truck. A dude had taken a motorcycle engine apart and put the parts in a tub of gasoline in his shed for cleaning. In the middle of summer, sometime in the middle of the night, he put on an army parka, the only thing he was wearing, lit a smoke and decided to take a look. By the time we showed up, he was still standing in the burning ruins of his exploded shed. Everything not covered by the parka had 3-degree burns, including his head, just standing in the middle of the flames. Next story. Not shocking so much as an interesting surprise. Called to a car fire, and by the time we got there, it had spread to a van next to it. Car was essentially gone, and van was a shell. Everything in it was burnt, except a pair of Timberland boots. Gave them a wipe down, and somehow they were still in one piece and wearable. Also, by that job, standing in BA next to a car fire, burning at almost 1,000 degrees Celsius. I look up and see a bystander in a yellow hoodie just toddling straight towards us through thick black smoke, looking through his phone and filming. Had to turn the hose on him to get him to back up. My dude, I'm safely standing next to the fire because I'm wearing thousands of pounds worth of kit designed for this exact purpose. I can't say the same for you. Yet, honestly, it makes you wonder how many people have been injured or worse just for the sake of getting a good TikTok reel or Instagram live. Like, come on, people. Next story. My grandfather was the platoon chief in our local fire department. He attended a call where a teenager tried to self-unalive by shooting in the face. Only didn't die. When my grandfather showed up, the boy was still writing a self-unaliving letter to his father with half his face blown off, seemingly no idea what he'd just done. He's still alive to this day, or was within the last decade. I used to see him walking around downtown, and he has no nose and half a face. This was one of the worst calls I'm aware of. I know he also attended a farming accident involving 2 kids and some heavy machinery. No survivors. And that one really effed him up too. It's insane to me to think about the fact that therapy just wasn't a thing back when he was working. He retired in the 90s and mostly never talked about any of this. My knowledge comes secondhand from my mom and grandma. Must have had PTSD from the things he saw. There's just no way you can live that every day and not have trauma. Next story. Mine's a little different since I work on a med-surg unit, but I'll never forget the way my heart ached when we had to admit an old lady from a nursing home who had extreme bruising that had nothing to do with her reason for admission. We suspected something was going on at the nursing home and was indirectly confirmed when we caught the nursing home staff sneaking up on the unit to take pics of her. Next story. ER nurse. So many. Inmate with a chicken or the egg injury of an obsession to grate his brain against anything he could find. As in, he would excessively rub his head against shower drains, toilet seat edges, anything, and wouldn't stop until he passed out. He had so many cranial surgeries, we couldn't keep skin flaps healthy long enough to cover the chunks of skull missing from his constant grating. They tried padded rooms, but he had rubbed away so much brain matter that there wasn't common sense to stop. Every time we had an incoming from the jail and a head injury, we knew who was coming. I saw so much brain tissue. A stripper who came in for her privates itching. When asked if she had any abnormal discharge, she said, well, then proceeded to look under her very long green fingernails. We pulled 12 used triangle makeup sponges from her privates because she was on her period and didn't have a tampon. Her LMP was 3 weeks prior. Ugh, the smell. A full back tattoo piece of the animated M&M characters as sci-fi fairies in a jungle scene. A teenager pulled out his own intestines in an effort to unalive himself, but then got cold feet and carried them upstairs to his father, who threw him in a private vehicle and raced him to the ER. But just before arriving, the kid decided he wanted to unalive still and tried to grab the steering wheel of the car and yank it off the road to crash. Dad luckily saved it, but was a swerving mess. The hospital was right next to federally protected building, so Homeland Security saw an erratic, speeding vehicle and tried to help. When the dad pulled up to the ER entrance and tried to explain, the officers understood and assisted getting the patient and his intestines into the trauma bay. One way to make a waiting room shut up about long wait times? A blood-trailing 3 officers with Homeland Security on their vests dragging a teenager with intestines trailing on the floor. Next story. Floated to the ER, and I can think of 2 that was new for me. First one was a 20-something-year-old schizophrenic PT that believed his privates were causing him to sin, making him want to remove it. He achieved this by slipping his member through the finger hole of a pocket knife and left it out for 3 months. Well, as you can imagine, it became necrotic, infected, and was only hanging on by a small bit of skin. I thought it was going to fall off when I lifted it to examine. The previous hospital attempted a Foley, and it came out the other side, and my God, the smell is something I don't think I could ever forget. Second one was a meth man who was BIBA who attempted to remove his testicles with pliers. Just a massive mess of mangled ballsack and blood. Next story. My first year out of PA school, and I was working in indigent ER/UC. A hermit wanders in with an eye infection he had for several months. I'd already learned to have patients take off their own bandages and clothing. Toes left in the sock was old hat by then. So I had him remove his bandage. The probable SCC had eaten both eyelids. Squamous cell carcinoma had probably started on the brow, but can start on the lid. His eyeball was a raisin on the floor of the orbital fossa. There was nothing left except a partially eroded orbital socket. Next story. ER doc, 15 years. Mom and dad get into an argument. Dad grabs up the newborn baby, puts it in a paper bag, puts some gas on it, and catches it on fire. Baby was sort of alive when it got to me. Middle-aged dude decides, F the police, comes out swinging with a knife, is promptly shot by police around 35 times. He had holes all over him. His brain was coming out of his mouth. EMS was doing CPR like crazy when they brought him in. High temp, industrial, injection, mold plastic is somehow injected into a dude's mouth and face. Entire upper extremities was covered in plastic. Guy lived. 103-year-old lady came in coding. No legs, 1 arm, on hemodialysis. Peg, feeding tube, looked like a skeleton. Family astonished when I told them she had passed. Got angry, wanted me to shock her again. She was cold and dead. Started fighting with each other in the waiting room. In the same way, the dad who brings his daughter in after she broke a nail, or the endless parents who wake their kids up at 2 a.m. to drive them to the ER because they have a fever is simply amazing to me, and I'll never understand it. That and why people don't just put a string on anything they put up their ass.